The acrid stench of smoke filled Xyla's nostrils as she pressed the blade to the human's throat. "Tell me how to disable your ship, or we both die here." Ethan's eyes locked onto hers, cold and unyielding, despite the fear she saw flickering beneath. "I'd rather die than betray my crew." Xyla hesitated, her mission clear, but her resolve wavering. The ship groaned ominously, a reminder of their precarious situation. She lowered the blade slightly, but kept it close enough to be a threat. "We don't have time for this. The ship is coming apart." Ethan took a slow, measured breath. "Then let's both get out of here alive." He gestured towards a corridor choked with smoke. "The main reactor is this way. We can stabilize it and buy ourselves some time." Reluctantly, Xyla nodded. "Lead the way, but try anything, and I won't hesitate." They moved quickly, navigating the war-torn corridors littered with debris and bodies. Each step was a reminder of the brutal conflict that had brought them here. As they approached a junction, a sudden explosion rocked the ship, throwing them off balance. Xyla stumbled, her alien reflexes barely saving her from a falling beam. Ethan caught her arm, pulling her to safety. "Stay close. This whole section could collapse any minute." She nodded, shaken by the near miss. "Why help me? You could have let me die." "Maybe I'm not the monster your people think I am," he replied, eyes scanning the corridor ahead for more dangers. The tension between them was palpable, a fragile truce born of necessity. They continued onward, their steps quickening as the sounds of structural failure grew louder. Reaching a sealed door, Ethan keyed in a sequence on the control panel. The door hissed open, revealing the reactor room beyond. Inside, the reactor core pulsed with unstable energy. Alarms blared, and warning lights flashed in a chaotic symphony. Ethan rushed to a control console, his fingers flying over the controls. "I can stabilize it, but I need you to hold those conduits together. If they separate, we're done." Xyla moved to the conduits, her hands steady despite the danger. "Tell me what to do. Just keep them aligned." "I'll handle the rest," Ethan said, his voice tense but focused. As they worked, the ship's violent tremors seemed to ease, but the danger was far from over. Sweat trickled down Ethan's face as he fought to control the reactor's wild energy. Xyla glanced at him, seeing the determination etched into his features. "Why are you so willing to risk your life?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the alarms. Ethan didn't look up from his work. "Because I've seen too many people die. If I can save even one more life, it's worth it." Xyla's resolve hardened. "I understand. I've seen too much death as well." They worked in silence, a strange camaraderie forming as they battled to stabilize the reactor. The ship's violent shudders began to subside, and for a moment it seemed they might succeed. Then, with a deafening roar, another section of the ship exploded, sending a shockwave through the reactor room. The force of the blast threw them both to the ground. Ethan groaned, struggling to rise as Xyla pulled herself up. The reactor's alarms had changed tone, a high-pitched wail, signaling imminent failure. "We need to get out of here," Ethan said, his voice hoarse. "Now." Xyla helped him to his feet. "Which way?" "The hangar bay," he replied, pointing to a nearby exit. "There should be shuttles there." They ran through the corridors, the ship's death throes echoing around them. Xyla's mind raced, calculating their chances of survival. She had come here with a mission, but now her priority was escape. As they reached the hangar bay, the sight that greeted them was both a relief and a disappointment. Only one shuttle remained, battered but intact. Ethan quickly assessed it. "It's not in great shape, but it'll have to do." They hurried aboard, Xyla taking the co-pilot's seat. Ethan powered up the shuttle, his hands steady despite the urgency. "Hold on," he warned as the engines roared to life. The shuttle shuddered, struggling to break free from the collapsing ship. Xyla watched as the warship's bulk began to fold in on itself, fiery explosions marking its final moments. With a lurch, The shuttle tore away, hurtling into the void. Xyla let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "We made it." "For now," Ethan replied, his expression serious. "But we're not safe yet. We need to find a place to land and make repairs." Xyla nodded, her mind already shifting to the next challenge. "Then let's find a planet, together." Xyla and Ethan pressed forward through the warship's twisted corridors, each step calculated and cautious. The ship groaned around them, metal bending and creaking under the stress of the battle it had endured. The tension between them was palpable, an uneasy truce forged in the fires of necessity. Ethan led the way, his engineering expertise guiding them through the labyrinth. Xyla followed closely, her senses heightened, plasma rifle at the ready. They turned a corner and found themselves in a dimly lit passageway, the flickering lights casting eerie shadows on the walls. "Stay close," Ethan muttered, glancing back at her. Xyla nodded, her eyes scanning the surroundings for any threats. A sudden clanging noise echoed down the corridor. Both of them froze, their weapons raised. Out of the darkness, a series of red lights blinked to life, revealing the silhouettes of automated defense drones. "Run!" Ethan shouted. They sprinted down the corridor as laser fire erupted behind them. Xyla fired back, her shots precise and deadly. The drones exploded in sparks and flames, but more were closing in. They ducked into a maintenance hatch, narrowly avoiding a barrage of lasers. The small space was cramped, forcing them to crouch close together. Xyla could hear the rapid beating of her own heart and Ethan's labored breathing. "How much further to the hangar bay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not far," Ethan replied, "but these drones are going to make it difficult." Xyla nodded. "We need to disable them. Can you hack into their control system?" Ethan hesitated, then nodded. "If we can get to the central control panel, I can shut them down." "Lead the way," Xyla said, determination stealing her voice. They emerged from the hatch and made their way to the control room. The path was fraught with danger, each turn bringing new obstacles. They fought through several skirmishes with the drones, their cooperation becoming more fluid with each encounter. Finally, they reached the control room. Ethan rushed to the central terminal and began typing furiously. Xyla stood guard, her weapon trained on the doorway. "How long will this take?" she asked, her eyes never leaving the corridor. "A few minutes," Ethan replied, his fingers flying over the keyboard. "Just keep them off me." Xyla gritted her teeth, her senses on high alert. She could hear the distant hum of approaching drones, their mechanical whirring growing louder. She took a deep breath, preparing for the onslaught. The first drone appeared, and Xyla fired a quick burst, hitting its power core. It exploded, but more followed. She fired rapidly, each shot precise, each target falling in a shower of sparks. "Ethan, hurry," she called out, her voice strained. "I'm almost there," he replied, his focus unwavering. The drones kept coming, a relentless tide of metal and fire. Xyla's plasma rifle grew hot in her hands, the recoil jolting her with each shot. She glanced at Ethan, seeing the sweat on his brow, the intensity of his concentration. "Got it?" Ethan shouted. He pressed a final key, and the drones suddenly went dark, their lights flickering out. Xyla sighed in relief, lowering her weapon. "Good job," she said, giving him a nod of approval. Ethan grinned, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "Let's move. The hangar bay is just ahead." They resumed their journey, the corridor now eerily silent. As they approached the hangar, they encountered another obstacle, a massive bulkhead, sealed shut by the ship's failing systems. "Damn it," Ethan muttered, examining the control panel. "It's locked down tight." "Can you override it?" Xyla asked, her frustration mounting. Ethan shook his head. "The system's fried. We'll have to find another way." Xyla glanced around, her eyes landing on a ventilation shaft. "What about there?" she suggested. Ethan followed her gaze and nodded. "It's risky, but it might be our only option. They pried open the grate and climbed into the narrow shaft. The metal was cold against their skin, the space claustrophobic. They crawled forward, their progress slow and arduous. "Why are you helping me?" Ethan asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Zyla hesitated, her mind racing. "Because right now, survival is more important than our differences," she replied, her voice firm. "We need each other." Ethan was silent for a moment, then he nodded. "I suppose you're right." They reached the end of the shaft and peered out into the hangar bay. It was a chaotic scene, the remains of destroyed shuttles and equipment scattered everywhere. But amidst the wreckage, one shuttle remained intact. "There it is," Ethan said, a note of hope in his voice. They climbed out of the shaft and made their way to the shuttle, their movements quick and efficient. Ethan worked on the shuttle's controls, while Zyla kept watch. The ship continued to groan and shudder, its structural integrity failing rapidly. "Hurry, Ethan," Zyla urged, her eyes scanning for any threats. "I'm on it," he replied, his focus intense. Finally, the shuttle powered up, its systems humming to life. Ethan gestured for Zyla to board, and she quickly followed him inside. They strapped in, the tension palpable. "Let's get out of here," Ethan said, his voice determined. As the shuttle lifted off, the hangar bay began to collapse around them. They shot out into space, just as the warship exploded in a brilliant flash of light. Zyla and Ethan exchanged a glance, a silent acknowledgement of their narrow escape. As they approached the planet's atmosphere, a distress signal flashed on the shuttle's console, hinting at more surprises and dangers awaiting them on the surface below. The ship's core hummed ominously, its flickering lights casting eerie shadows across the metallic walls. Zyla moved cautiously, her eyes darting around as she took in the labyrinth of cables and control panels. Her mission was clear: sabotage the ship's core and ensure the humans could not salvage it. But now, with Ethan at her side, the task felt less straightforward. Ethan worked feverishly at a console, trying to stabilize the failing systems. His brow furrowed in concentration. He barely glanced at Zyla. "We don't have much time," he muttered, his voice strained. "If we can't stabilize the core, this whole section will blow." Zyla's heart pounded in her chest. She knew she had to act, but something held her back. She watched Ethan, noting the determination in his eyes. He was a formidable enemy, yet here they were, working together. The thought unsettled her. Ethan glanced at her, suspicion flickering in his eyes. "You seem distracted. Something you want to share?" Zyla forced herself to focus. "Just evaluating our options," she replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil within. "We need to ensure our escape route is clear." He nodded, accepting her explanation for now. "Right, you check the exits. I'll keep working on this." As Zyla moved through the core room, her mind raced. Completing her mission meant betraying Ethan. The idea left a bitter taste in her mouth. She had always believed in her duty, in the righteousness of her cause. But now, faced with the reality of the human she had been taught to hate, doubts crept in. Ethan's voice broke through her thoughts. "Hey, can you hand me that toolkit? This stabilizer is fried." She retrieved the toolkit and handed it to him, their fingers brushing momentarily. The contact sent a jolt through her, a reminder of their shared humanity. Ethan gave her a brief, grateful smile before turning back to his work. "Why are you fighting?" she asked suddenly, the question escaping before she could stop it. Ethan paused, looking up at her with a mixture of surprise and contemplation. "For my family, for my friends, to protect what's left of our home." He shrugged, a hint of sadness in his eyes. "We didn't start this war, but we have to finish it." Zyla felt a pang of empathy. And if it could end differently, without more bloodshed? Ethan's gaze hardened. "It's too late for that. Too many lives have been lost." She nodded, understanding his resolve, but feeling the weight of her own indecision. Could she really condemn him and countless others to death? The thought gnawed at her, making her question everything she had been taught. A sudden tremor rocked the ship, and alarms blared, signaling another critical failure. Ethan cursed under his breath, working faster. "We're running out of time. I need to reroute the power, or we're done for." Zyla knew this was her moment. She could use the chaos to sabotage the core, fulfilling her mission. She moved to a panel, her fingers hovering over the controls. But instead of initiating the sabotage sequence, she found herself assisting Ethan, rerouting power and stabilizing the failing systems. Ethan glanced at her, confusion evident. "What are you doing?" "Helping," she replied simply, her voice firm. "We need to get out of here alive." He studied her for a moment, then nodded, accepting her aid. Together, they worked in a synchronized rhythm, their combined efforts slowing the ship's inevitable destruction. Just as they managed to stabilize the core, the door to the room burst open and a patrol of human soldiers stormed in, weapons raised. Zyla and Ethan froze, the sudden threat bringing their tenuous alliance to a breaking point. "Hold your fire," Ethan shouted, stepping in front of Zyla. "She's with me." The soldiers hesitated, their eyes darting between Ethan and the alien beside him. "Sir, she's the enemy." "She saved us," Ethan insisted. "Lower your weapons." Reluctantly, the soldiers obeyed, their eyes filled with distrust. Zyla felt their hostility like a physical force, but she stood her ground, her gaze steady. Ethan turned to her, his expression conflicted. "We need to move. The ship's core is stable for now, but we have to get to the shuttle bay." Zyla nodded, understanding the urgency. As they made their way through the ship, the tension between them palpable, she couldn't shake the feeling that her decision to help Ethan had irrevocably altered her path. They reached the hangar bay, only to find it in chaos. Debris littered the floor, and the remaining shuttle was in bad shape. Ethan quickly assessed the situation, his mind working rapidly. "We need to repair the thrusters if we want any chance of making it out." As they worked together to fix the shuttle, Zyla couldn't help but reflect on the strange turn her life had taken. In a matter of hours, she had gone from seeing humans as faceless enemies to recognizing the shared struggle for survival. Her mission felt like a distant memory, replaced by a new determination to find a different way forward. With the shuttle finally operational, they boarded and prepared for launch. The ship shuddered violently as another explosion echoed through the corridors. Ethan's hands flew over the controls, his face set in grim determination. "Hold on. This is going to be rough." Zyla's breathing was harsh and ragged as she and Ethan burst through a smoke-filled corridor, the ship's alarms blaring around them. Each step felt like a race against time. They had narrowly escaped the human patrol, and now the hangar bay was within sight. The scent of burning metal and the acrid tang of melted wires filled the air, assaulting her senses. "We're almost there," Ethan shouted over the din, his voice laced with urgency. His eyes flickered with determination, and Zyla felt a pang of unexpected respect. She had seen that look in her own comrades, a fierce resolve to survive no matter the odds. The ship shuddered violently, throwing them against the bulkhead. Zyla's vision blurred momentarily, and she tasted blood where she'd bitten her lip. Ethan pulled her to her feet, his grip firm and reassuring. "Come on, we don't have much time," he urged, propelling her forward. They sprinted down the final stretch, dodging debris and leaping over fissures that had opened in the deck. The hangar bay door loomed ahead, but a heavy beam had collapsed in front of it, blocking their path. Zyla's heart sank. "We'll have to find another way," she said, her voice tight with frustration. "No," Ethan replied, shaking his head. "We're going through." He grabbed a discarded metal rod and wedged it under the beam, using all his strength to lift it. Zyla joined him, their combined effort barely enough to create a narrow gap. She slipped through first, then helped Ethan squeeze through. Inside the hangar, chaos reigned. Shuttlecrafts lay in ruins, their hulks twisted and scorched. Only one shuttle remained intact, its hull battered but seemingly functional. They raced towards it, the ship's groans and creaks a constant reminder of their dwindling time. Ethan keyed the access panel, and the shuttle's hatch hissed open. "Get in," he yelled, pushing Zyla inside before clambering in after her. The hatch sealed shut behind them, muffling the cacophony outside. Zyla strapped herself into the co-pilot's seat, fingers flying over the controls. "We need to launch now," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Ethan nodded, his focus razor-sharp as he powered up the shuttle. The engines roared to life, and Zyla felt the vibrations through her seat. She glanced at Ethan, his face set in grim determination, and felt an odd sense of camaraderie. They were in this together, survival hinging on their cooperation. The shuttle lurched as it lifted off the deck, the hangar bay shrinking below them. A massive explosion rocked the ship, sending shockwaves through the shuttle. Ethan fought the controls, his knuckles white with strain. "Hold it steady," Zyla called out, monitoring their trajectory. "We need to clear the blast zone." Ethan gritted his teeth, muscles straining as he maneuvered the shuttle. They shot out of the hangar just as the warship's core went critical. A blinding flash enveloped the shuttle, and the force of the explosion hurled them through space. Zyla's heart pounded in her chest as the shuttle stabilized. She glanced at the rear display, watching the warship disintegrate into a fiery cloud. Relief washed over her, tempered by the realization that they were now adrift in the void. Ethan's voice broke the silence. "We're clear, but the navigation systems are damaged. We'll have to find a safe place to land manually." Zyla nodded, taking a deep breath. "Let's focus on finding a habitable planet. We'll need supplies and a place to regroup." Ethan set the shuttle on a course for a nearby system, their best chance for survival. The journey was tense, each minute stretching into eternity. They worked in silence, the weight of their situation hanging heavy between them. As they approached the target system, Zyla scanned the planets, her eyes lighting up as she found a likely candidate. "There," she pointed. "It has an atmosphere and looks stable enough." Ethan adjusted their course, and the shuttle descended towards the planet. The re-entry was rough, the shuttle shaking violently as it pierced the atmosphere. Zyla held her breath, hoping their luck would hold. The shuttle finally broke through the clouds, revealing a verdant landscape below. Ethan expertly navigated them to a flat plain, setting the shuttle down with a bone-jarring thud. The engines whined and powered down, leaving a deafening silence in their wake. Zyla unstrapped herself, her body aching from the ordeal. She glanced at Ethan, his face etched with exhaustion, but also a glimmer of relief. They had made it, against all odds. "We need to secure the area and assess our supplies," Ethan said, already moving towards the hatch. Zyla nodded, following him outside. The fresh air was a stark contrast to the recycled atmosphere of the ship, and she took a moment to savor it. The planet was lush and teeming with life, a sharp contrast to the destruction they had left behind. As they began setting up a makeshift camp, a faint distress signal crackled through their comms. Zyla and Ethan exchanged a wary glance. They were not alone. "We should investigate," Ethan said, checking his equipment. "It could be survivors or something else entirely." The shuttle shuddered violently as it tore free from the dying warship, its hull glowing red-hot from the re-entry friction. Ethan and Zyla sat in the cramped cockpit, their hands flying over the controls as they fought to keep the vessel on course. The view outside shifted from the blackness of space to a swirl of green and blue, the unknown planet that was their only hope. "Hold on!" Ethan shouted over the roar of the engines. "This is going to be rough." Zyla tightened her grip on the console, her eyes fixed on the rapidly approaching surface. The planet's atmosphere buffeted the shuttle, making it lurch and groan. Ethan's brow furrowed in concentration as he manipulated the controls, desperately trying to stabilize their descent. The shuttle hit the ground with a bone-jarring thud, skidding across the grassy plain before finally coming to a halt. For a moment, they sat in stunned silence, their hearts pounding in their chests. "We made it," Ethan said at last, a grin spreading across his face. "I can't believe we actually made it." Zyla exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "We're alive," she murmured, almost in disbelief. They unbuckled their harnesses and stepped out into the bright sunlight, blinking as their eyes adjusted. The air was fresh and cool, filled with the scent of flowers and earth. Around them stretched a vast landscape of rolling hills dotted with strange alien flora. In the distance, they could see mountains rising against the sky, their peaks shrouded in mist. "It's beautiful," Zyla said softly, her voice tinged with awe. Ethan nodded, taking in their surroundings. A far cry from the war zones we're used to. They spent the next few hours exploring their new environment, gathering what supplies they could salvage from the shuttle. They found shelter in a nearby cave, its entrance hidden behind a curtain of vines. Inside, they discovered a bubbling spring of crystal-clear water, a welcome respite from the heat of the sun. As night fell, they sat by a small fire, the crackling flames casting dancing shadows on the cave walls. The sky above was a canopy of stars, brighter and more numerous than any they had seen before. "We should take turns keeping watch," Ethan suggested. "We don't know what kind of wildlife might be out there." Zyla nodded in agreement. "I'll take the first shift." Ethan lay down on the makeshift bed they had crafted from shuttle fabric, exhaustion finally overtaking him. As he drifted off, he glanced at Zyla, who sat alert by the cave entrance, her plasma rifle resting on her knees. Hours later, Zyla gently shook Ethan awake for his turn. "All quiet," she reported, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded, sitting up and rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "Get some rest," he said. "I'll take it from here." As Zyla lay down, Ethan moved to the cave entrance, staring out into the darkness. His mind wandered to the events that had brought them here, the tenuous alliance they had formed, and the bond that had grown between them. Just as he was beginning to relax, a faint, rhythmic beeping caught his attention. Frowning, he moved back to the shuttle's wreckage and activated the comms panel. A distress signal, weak but unmistakable, blinked on the screen. "Zyla," he called softly, urgency in his voice. "You need to see this." She was at his side in an instant, her eyes widening as she took in the signal. "We're not alone," she said, her voice filled with both hope and caution. "Looks like it's coming from the other side of those mountains," Ethan said, pointing at the distant peaks. Zyla nodded. "We should investigate, but carefully. We have no idea who or what we'll find." The next morning, they set out at first light, packing only the essentials and leaving the rest of their supplies hidden in the cave. The journey was arduous, the terrain rugged and unfamiliar. They moved cautiously, alert to any signs of danger. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the air grew thinner and colder. The landscape shifted from lush greenery to rocky outcrops and sparse vegetation. Despite the hardships, they pushed on, driven by the need to discover the source of the distress signal. After several days of grueling travel, they finally crested a ridge and looked down into a sheltered valley. There, nestled among the rocks, was a small encampment, its structures cobbled together from various materials. Ethan raised his binoculars, scanning the camp. "Looks like a mix of humans and Exalari," he said, surprised. "Maybe other survivors?" Zyla's eyes narrowed as she focused on the scene below. "We need to approach carefully. If they're hostile, we could be walking into a trap." They descended into the valley, moving stealthily from cover to cover. As they neared the camp, a figure emerged from one of the makeshift tents. It was an older man, human, his face lined with age and hardship. "Halt!" Ethan called out, raising his hand in a gesture of peace. "We come in peace. We're survivors, like you." The man looked at them, his eyes wary but not unfriendly. "You're a long way from home," he said, his voice gravelly. We all are, Zyla replied, stepping forward. We're looking for refuge, and maybe some answers. The man's gaze shifted to Zyla, then back to Ethan. "You found it," he said at last. "Welcome to Haven."